Today's daf we're going to be learning is Masechet Sanhedrin daf Mem Vav. Today's daf is sponsored by Joyce Ben David in tremendous appreciation of Rabbanit Farber, who inspired me to begin learning the daily daf. And today's daf is sponsored by Lori Shulden Shore with gratitude for the constant love and support of her husband, Joshua Shore. Okay, we're going to get started with from the bottom of the Mishnah. Again, this is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started. We saw the Mishnah, which had some debates between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. And today we're going to follow those debates and understand the sources for them. So we started with this first debate between them about who gets hung. Are everybody who gets stoned gets hung? Or is it only the Migadef and the Oved Avodah Zarah? Okay, the one who curses God and worships idols. So we started with this Braita, V'humat V'talita. You might have thought that includes everyone, but then it says, Ki kilelat Elohim taloi. Okay, we'll bring up the verses here and we'll show you the study guide so you can see. Ki yebi'ish chet mishpat mavet. We're in Devarim chapter 21, verse 22. When a person does something that's deserving of the death penalty, v'humat, and he is killed, v'talita oto ala eitz, he gets hung on the tree. Lo talin livnato ala eitz. We're going to learn all this today. Don't leave it hanging on the tree. Ki kavor tikberenu b'yom. On that day, you have to bury it. The person, ki kilelat Elohim talui. Okay, because the one who cursed God is hanging, velote tameat admatcha, and we don't want to contaminate the earth. Asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha nachala. So we're going to darshan in this pasuk later, but we're going to start with this Braita. So the Braita had said, "Mama kalel zeh shebeskila, av kol shebeskila." Okay, just like the one who curses God gets stoned, it therefore includes all those who get stoned. And the rabbis said, no, the one who curses God, kafar bi'ikal, and therefore it's only things that are directly against God. Not all punishments of skila are a slap in the face of God. Maybe you can say in a more general way, but this only includes idol worship and cursing God. So then we said, what's really the machloket? And we said, Rabbanan darshe klali uprati, Rabbi Eliezer darish riboy umiyute. Okay, these are two different methods that are very similar, but one is more, it excludes a little more and one excludes a little less. So we're going to see the difference right now. Rabbanan darshe klali uprate. How does it work? Well, it says v'humat v'talita, right? Meaning anyone who gets killed, anyone, right? The first pasuk said ish b'chet mishpat mavet, generally any death penalty, and then it said ki kilelat, which was more specific. So we're going to call that, as you can see from the chart, Rabbi Eliezer is going to call it a riboy and a miut, and Chachamim we're going to call it a klal and prat. Okay, in general, they're kind of similar, but we've seen in the past that there's differences between them. About again, it's a matter of how much the prat is specifying only this, or is it a little more general than that? So now we're going to say the following. Ki kilelat prat. So again, v'humat v'talit is the klal, ki kilelat is the prat. But if you notice, the first pasuk is the general, ki yebi'ish chet mishpat mavet v'humat v'talita, and then it says, okay, and then once you do that, you do it on the tree. Don't leave it hanging on the tree because you have to bury the person on that day. Ki kilelat Elohim taloi. Now that's already separated from the klalu prat. So it's a little different than a classic klalu prat, or when we get to Rabbi Eliezer, it's different than a classic riboy v'miut. So they're going to say the following. If they were right near each other, then we would say it's a regular klalu prat, and it's only the prat, which would be only cursing God. So just that, nothing else. Now that they're separated from each other, so once they're separated, then we're going to say that includes something else. Well, something else other than just what that is. This is the very exclusionary one, only this. Therefore, we're going to say, it also includes avodah zarah, which is similar to it in all ways, because again, they're both against God. Rabbi Eliezer darish riboy miyuta, because they're going to say v'humat v'talita riboy. Ki kilelat miyut. Again, same thing. This is general, this is specific. And again, if they were near each other, we would have only included, now here we're going to be a little already including more, which is if it was right near it, we would say also avodah zarah. In other words, things that are very similar to it. A riboy and a miut is going to already include more things that are specific, that are similar to that specific item. But now, since they're separate from each other, it's going to already include more. What's the more going to be? Other people who get stoned. And that's how Rabbi Eliezer gets to all people who get stoned are hung. Now we're going to get to the next machlokah between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. We're going to have Ha'ish tolin, right? And now we have a machloket. Also the women or not? So Rabbi Eliezer said, Ha'ish tolin oto panav klapei ha'am, va'isha panav klapei ha'etz, right? The man gets hung in one way, the woman gets hung in a different direction, but the fact is they both get hung. And the rabbis say only the man is hung and not the woman. So my time I Rabbanan, Amar Krava Talita Oto, he's going to say, okay, you can already see I crossed it out, so assume we're going to reject this. But the rabbis say Talita Oto, Oto Velota. It's a classic drasha in the Torah. It's listed in the masculine, even though generally the Hebrew language works in masculine. But in the world of drasha, we can often darshan that. It says Oto, Oto Velota. For Rabbi Eliezer, Oto, below Ksuto, Rabbi Eliezer says Oto doesn't mean him and not her. Oto means we hang him without clothing. Okay, the man doesn't have his clothing on. You might have thought that we cover the man. Okay, even though the man is naked when we stone them, you might have thought we cover when we hang. No, we don't cover the body. Okay, this is a hard image to imagine, but that's the halach. Birabanan, what do they say? In Achinami, they say, you know what, you're right. Oto really is Oto below Ksuto. And then where do we get Ish below Ishat from a different part of the verse? Ella amakra v'chi bi'ish chet. Right? What did it say in the beginning of that pasuk? Ki bi'ish chet mishpat mavet. If the man sins and is liable the death penalty, ish v'lo isha. From there we get a man and not a woman. For Rabbi Eliezer, so now we have to do the ping pong. What does Rabbi Eliezer do with the pasuk? V'chi bi'ish chet. So he says, my Darish Bey, Amarish Lakish, Hawilami Ute Ben Soreo Umore. Says ish, right? Just like Oto didn't mean man and not female, right? But man and not woman. But also ish doesn't mean man and not woman. It means ish, a man, a grown man and not a child. For example, like a Ben Soreo More. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute, how could that possibly be? Again, you're going to see it's crossed out here. So Hatanya, it says in a Braita, Ben Soreo More and Niskal V'nitle. He is hung, and he is, okay, this is a child who rebels against his parents. We're going to learn all about it later on. There's a whole chapter called Ben Sarah Moreh, is stoned and is hung. So, and it's Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. He thinks that himself. So you can't say it comes to exclude Ben Sarah Moreh. So forget what Rav Rish Lakish said. It's to exclude Ben Sarah Moreh. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak comes and corrects and says, no. Rabbi Eliezer must say, Ki Be'ish comes to include Ben Sorero Mored, that he also gets stoned. Now, how are you going to get that from there? And why would you think to exclude him? Well, my time, the Amar Kra, Ki Be'ish Chet, Ish Below Ben. Now, you might have thought, here we're going to explain the whole logic of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, how he explains Rabbi Eliezer and how he darshans Ki Be'ish Chet. You might have thought, Ish Below Ben. Chet, well, Misha al Chetone Herag, Yatza Ben Sorer Moresh al Shum Safone Herag. We have actually two reasons to exclude the Ben Sorer Moreh. Number one, he's not a full grown man. Number two, it says when you have a chet, you did a sin. Now, the Ben Sorer Moreh we're going to learn is Nidon al Shem Safo. It's a fascinating concept, which we're going to delve into much later, which is that Ben Sorer Moreh is accused for eating a lot of food and drinking a lot of drink, and we're concerned that that's going to bring the Ben Sorer Moreh to sin later on. And we actually punish the Ben Sorer Moreh for actions now that are not so terrible, but are going to lead to actions later. So he doesn't really have a chait. He's nidon al shem safo, about what he's going to do in the future. So now we have two reasons to exclude the Ben Sorer Moreh. Now this is like a double negative. A double negative equals a positive, and that's what they're going to say here. Havi mi'ut achar mi'ut, ve'en mi'ut achar mi'ut, ela l'rabot. When you have an exclusion and another exclusion, one right after the other, that's like a double negative, and it turns into a positive, and that comes to include the Ben Sorer Moreh, and that's what he does with the pasuk ish, since he doesn't learn ish v'lo isha. So we went through these two machlokot of Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim in the Mishnah, and we saw their sources in the Torah. Amar lahem Rabbi Eliezer, v'alo Shimon ben Shatach tala nashim. But wait, Shimon ben Shatach hung women, right? So here he says, look, from here you see women got hung. So Amar of Chist, if you remember, right, what happens in the Mishnah? So we said Shimon Shatach hung these women that were involved in witchcraft, or so he claimed, right? Talana Shiba Ashkelon, Amru lo Shmonim Nashim Tala, the Ein Danim Shnayim B'Yom Echad, which the rabbi said this was clearly an exception to the rule because he killed 80 people in one day, and you're not allowed to kill more than one person in the court in one day, and therefore this is what we call a hora'at sha'ah. There was a need to do something. Sometimes we bend the halacha or we change the halacha for a moment to make a point. And therefore, you can't learn from there the fact that he hung these women, he hung them for a particular reason. So now, Amar Rav Chisda. Now we want to go back to how do we know that it was exceptional what he did? He hung these 80 women all in one day. Amar Rav Chisda, lo shanu ela b'shtei mitot, aval b'mita achat danim. So they say, wait a minute. Rav Chisda said that the only problem, and we learned this already, is when the only problem with killing people all in one day is you can't kill more than two people in one day if it's two different death penalties. But these women were all the same. And we're going to learn that they each did possibly different things. Some maybe did bringing up the people from the dead. Some people did Baal Ov. That's Baal Ov, Yid Oni. There were different kinds of witchcraft and different kinds of lotases that they transgressed. But they all had the same death penalty associated with it. So he says, right, but we do judge people if they have the same death penalty. To which they say, Hama said to Shimon something doesn't work here because it said that Shimon ben Shetach did something against the law. And we know that this was within the law because you can, according to Rav Chisda, this was within the law because as long as it's all the same death penalty, it's fine. So we have to change Rav Chisda because Rav Chisda doesn't match our Mishnah. Our Mishnah seems very clear that Shimon ben Shetach was not allowed to kill these women all in one day. It was only because it was a special, unique circumstance. But had it been regular circumstances, they couldn't all be killed in one day, even though it's all the same death penalty. So we're going to adjust Rav Chisda to make it make sense. Lo shanu ela b'mita achat ke'en shtei mitot. So we're talking about one death that's like multiple deaths. What does that mean? If it's two different sins, transgressions, but yet there's the same death penalty, that's already, even though it's the same death penalty, we're going to view that as two different things that can't be judged in one day. Only mita achat v'avera achat danim. The only case you can do is if it's one death and one sin. But if it's two sins, one death penalty, or, which was what the women had, or one sin and two death penalties, which we'll get to soon, also that would be a problem, okay? If there was one sin, but yet there were two different death penalties to two different people, which we'll see why that would be, you also don't judge it. I'm sorry, you also could judge it because that's what you can't judge. If it's all the same, it would have to be same transgression, same death penalty. That's the only way we could do it. And that's not Shimon ben Shetach. And that's why his was an exception to the rule. And that works now with the rereading of Rav Chisda. So now, Mativ Rabba Brava, he says, wait a minute. It says in a different source, Ein danim shnayim b'yom echad v'afilu b'no'ef v'no'efet. It says you can't judge two people in one day, even adulterer and adulteress. The man and woman who slept with each other, now both of them get strangulation. That's one sin, one death penalty. And it says even that you can't do, even in one day. So then Rav Chisda has nowhere to go. In other words, how can we possibly explain Rav Chisda? To which the Gemara explains Rav Chisda. Okay? Just to understand the structure, because it's a little bit confusing. One second. I'm going to share my screen again and show you in the chart what we did here. We have a difficulty on this Mishnah of Shimon ben Shetach that he hung these women against the law, even though, again, it was okay for him to do, but in normal circumstances, it wouldn't be. We raise a difficulty from Rav Chisda, who said you can't have, right, two different deaths in one day, but you can't have one death penalty. So it seems to be a problem because Shimon ben Shetach seems to be on the side of we can do it. To which they answer, no, we change Rav Chisda, and Shimon ben Shetach ends up on the other side, because on the forbidden to. Why? Because we say one death, which is like two deaths, which is two different sins, which all have the same death penalty. Okay? Or theoretically, right? And then we would have basically on the other side, one death and one death penalty, one sin and one death penalty. That would be the only thing that would be permitted. Not one death with two sins, which is what we thought originally. And again, remember, the women engaged in all different actions and different transgressions that was getting them killed. So now we said, but wait, it sounds like you could do one death and one sin, like an no'ef no'efet. To which we're going to answer according to Rav Chisda. He must explain it to Rav Chisda, bebat kohenu bo'ala, a daughter of a Kohen who is a no'efet, who commits adultery with a man. She gets streifa because she's the daughter of a Kohen and is disgracing her family name. And he gets strangulation, which is the usual sin for no'ef. So that would be a case of one death that's like, it's actually two different deaths, right? That would be the other permutation. We have different cases that are forbidden, right? And the ein danim shtayim b'yom echad would be two different deaths, even though it's just one action, which would be equal to, right? It would be the same as one death with two different transgressions, which is the Shimon ben Shattach story. So then we say, or bebat kohen v'zomimei zomimeha. This is a bit of a complicated case. Okay, there's a unique exception for zomimim, for edim that testified against a bat kohen who engaged in adultery. So in the pasuk it says the punishment for edim zomimim is kasher zamam la'asot la'achiv, to his brother. They say la'achiv v'lo la'achoto. So if somebody says we saw a couple committing adultery, a man and a woman who was the daughter of a kohen, and they turned out to be liars, then what happens? We give them the punishment, kasher zamam la'asot la'achiv v'lo la'achoto. So they get chenek, they don't get streif. So now we have to get to the complicated case. So edim zomimim of a bat kohen, if they lied and said she committed adultery, they would get the punishment of not streifa, not like she gets, they would get chenek, strangulation. So what if there was a case where witnesses came and testified about her, and then witnesses came and said, you're lying, we were with you. But then it's another group of witnesses. So we have one group of witnesses who testify about her. Second group of witnesses knock out the first group. But then a third group of witnesses come and knock out the second group, which basically reinstates the first group, which means the woman's going to get killed. But the zomimim, the ones who lied and said that the edim were zomimim, they tried to get the edim killed, they're actually going to get the punishment of chenek. So we have the zomimim of the zomimeha, right? The ones who knocked out, right? Who were knocked out on behalf of her. So again, that reinstated the first, she's going to get the death penalty and they're going to get the other one. So those zomimim who knocked out the false witnesses that were deemed to be false, but now are deemed to be true, actually convict her and convict the second group of witnesses. So that would be another case where it's one action, but yet two different punishments. And that would be a case you can't judge them both on the same day. Okay, that was a little bit of a complicated section to basically try to understand how Rav Chisda works in with the case in the Mishnah of Shimon ben Shattach. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Shamati shebeitim makim v'onshin. Okay, now because we talked about Hora'at Sha'ah in a case where you can kind of bend the law or change the law a little bit, we're now going to say that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, I heard that in the Beit Din, makim v'onshin shalom min Torah, that sometimes they can give punishments against Torah law, meaning even if Torah law doesn't mean you're supposed to get that punishment, they can. Not to do it as a way to go against the Torah and establish this as a new thing for all time. We're going to go against the Torah, but you can do it to prevent the Torah from getting messed up, right? So here we had these 80 witches, right? It's like Shimon ben Shattach, and he had to do something about it and did something that was maybe not in sync with the law, but there was a reason. So likewise, he says the Beit Din can do this. And Maaseh be'echad she'rachav al sus b'Shabbat. We're going to have two examples. There was a case of someone who was riding on a horse b'mei yivanim on Shabbat. He was riding a horse on Shabbat. Some people have the version not on Shabbat, and it was just the issue he was riding horses, and that was like the Greeks. But other people say he was riding a horse on Shabbat in the time of the Greeks because there was a lot. I assume the issue is there was a lot of Hellenization. People were becoming like the Greeks, and they weren't keeping laws. And so when someone was riding a horse on Shabbat, which only is forbidden by rabbinic law, and you don't get the death penalty, but they stoned him because they needed to make a point and say, you must keep Shabbat. Not because you were supposed to do that, because they needed to do it at that moment to make a point. There was another man who had relations with his own wife under a fig tree, and they gave him lashes in the court. Okay, what was the problem here? Some people think that they had no idea. People would see this couple engaging in relations, not knowing who they were, assuming who engages in relations under a tree, if not someone who's committing adultery. And they would have thought, again, it must have been a time where people were committing adultery. It was a very common thing. And therefore, they gave this person lashes to make a point. So here you see that the Beit Din both can administer the death penalty and give lashes, even when the Torah doesn't say so. This is very interesting, especially in light of everything we saw before, that we try not to convict unless, right, you really have to. And yet it seems like there's some other thing called a Hora'at Sha'ah, which is, everything is different then. Everything is suspended. And really, we got to that because of Shimon ben Shattach. New Mishnah. Ketzad tolinoto. Now we're going to get to the nitty-gritty details of how people were hung. So you have a beam in the ground, stuck into the ground. Then you have a piece like in a shape of an L shape, okay, an upside down L, or in Hebrew a chaf sofit, and it's coming out of the top from the wall or from that beam that's coming out. Sorry, not the wall. I just read the wrong line. Va'etz yotzei, it comes out of that other beam. Umakish adav zo, and you put the arms together, you intertwine them, or like one on top of the other. V'toleuto, and then you hang the body like that. Rabbi Yossi Omer, hakore mutar al hakotel, v'toleuto kederech shav tabachin osin. We don't really know this the way the butchers would hang the animals, but basically what they'd say is you don't stick it into the ground. You take a wall, you take a beam, you lean it on an angle up against the wall, and then you put the body on that beam, like the way they do with the animals when they want to take the flesh off, right? When they skin the animal before, preparing it. So that's what they would do. Umitirino tomiyad. So now, very interesting. We hang, and then immediately we unhang the person. It's like we do it for a second. You're even going to see later some language which seems very clear that it was very quick. And when you read the psukim, and this is another interesting case where seems like the psukim want, right? Humat, you kill the person, then talito tola eitz. And it sounds like we want this to be seen. The problem is the next pasuk says, don't leave it overnight, bury it, right? And we don't want it to be hanging, and then people will disgrace the name of God, and it'll destroy it'll impurify your land. Seems to be some issue of not leaving this for too long. But the rabbis took it to, not an hour, not 2 hours, no, like immediately. We're going to hang it for a second, okay? And we're going to see this soon also, even more so. The imlan, okay, now what if you left it overnight? Over alav below taseh, you've committed a negative transgression. Shneimar lo talin yivlato ala eitz ki kavortik berenu ki kalalat Elohim talui, as we read in the pasuk. Klomar, what does that mean? Well, we don't want people to walk by, see the body hanging, and say, Mipnei mazeh talui, why is this person hanging? And then they'll get answer, Mipnei sheberechet Hashem. Berechet Hashem is a way of saying, even though it sounds like they bless God, it's what we call lashon sagina hor. We're going to meet this later today also, where you flip the words because you don't really want to say someone cursed God. So cursed God is actually said as bless God, but obviously everyone knows the person was cursed. And then the name of God, people will say, oh, he cursed God. And even just saying curse God, it's like if someone says what that person's saying, you say it was a curse word, and then you say the curse word, you've already said the curse word. We don't want you doing that. We don't want people to say God was cursed. That sounds like a terrible thing. So we don't want to leave the body out there. Amar Rabbi Meir. Okay, now we get into this idea that in God's name, God is cursed. How does God feel about this? Now, God doesn't really feel, right? We don't really believe this, but the question is when this is happening, and I just want to see one thing because it's actually an interesting language. Right. So Rashi says what we mean here is shapornu ba'alat avono. When someone gets punished like this, okay, and this is the idea that you see in the pasuk, there's some sympathy here on the part of God. God doesn't want the body hanging. Now, it does seem like it's because we don't want the name of God disgraced, but it's more than that. It's that God is sympathetic to the situation. So how does God feel? Again, God doesn't feel, but we're going to say, what does the Shekhinah say? Kalani miroshi, kalani mizroi. Okay, kalani meaning I'm light in my head, I am light in my arms, meaning really the opposite again. We're doing Lashon Sagina Hor, I am heavy. I am very, very heavy, okay? My head is heavy, my arms are heavy from this terrible thing that now someone is getting killed. If God is upset when evil people get destroyed, right, and get killed, all the more so when it's righteous people. And not only did they say this, but now this is all if, right, you hang someone, you can't leave them hanging, you have to bury them that day. Now they say there's even a low taseh al kol ha'melin meto. If a person dies and you don't bury that person on that day, okay, don't worry. I know we don't always do this, and we'll get to that momentarily. Kol ha'melin meto over below taseh. It's a negative commandment to basically you transgress a negative commandment if you don't bury the body that day, and that's why in Judaism we really try as hard as we can to bury the body that day. Now the Mishnah says, "Helino lichvodo." If you want to do it for the person's respect. If you want to bring them in aron and there is none right now, you need a coffin, or you need clothing, the shrouds to put on, and you don't have them. Anything for the respect of the dead person, and that's why people push it off for relatives to come from abroad and all that, because that's respect for the dead person. Then, even though there's a debate about this, we'll get to it soon. Okay, back now to our topic, which is when the person was stoned, we don't bury them where their family is buried, their family burial plot. We split it into the two categories, the more severe and the less severe, and there was a separate cemetery for those people and a separate cemetery for those people. Now, once the flesh rotted, Milaktim et ha'atzamot. This was something that was very common, gathering the bones. They would gather the bones with kavrim tobim koman. Later, they would move it to the burial plot of their forefathers. Okay, so they would first go temporarily to this other place where it was meant for all the people like them, and then eventually they do get brought to burial with their family. This is very interesting. We have the relatives come and ask the judges and the witnesses, how are you? And we hope you're doing well. We're not upset with you for any reason. We know you judge truthfully. Okay. There has to be this understanding of the family that the court is not to blame for this. Okay. But the person's actions are to blame. And they actually weren't allowed, and this is maybe part of the reason they do she'elat shalom. You're not supposed to greet people and all that when you're sitting shiva. People aren't supposed to greet you, but you're not really allowed to do any sort of public mourning for this person who is killed by the death penalty. The only thing you could do is onanim. Now, onain usually means that first day before the burial and that you're in a status of onain. Here, it doesn't really mean that. It means she'ein aninut ela balev. In other words, you can be sad about it because it's your relative, and of course you're allowed to be sad, but that's just in your heart. But you can't do any sort of public display of mourning for one of these people, okay, who was killed by the death penalty. Now we're going to get into the Gemara and we're going to talk about Tanu Rabbanan, okay? Ilu ne'emal chet v'talita, hayiti omer tolinoto. Now we're going to talk about this hanging issue. And as I told you before, we're going to really limit how long the person is hung for. If it had said chet v'talita, okay, remember the pasuk, ki yeh be'ish chet mishpat mavet, v'humat v'talita. It says someone does a sin, then they are killed, and then they hang. Now, if it had said just chet and v'talita without the word v'humat, hayiti omer tolinoto b'achar kach mimitzimoto kederach shamachut oseh. Now they start comparing it. And in general, you can think about, the times that they're living in and crucifixion and all that. And it's clear there's conversations going on here and issues that the rabbis were grappling with the Christians. Anyway, so I would have thought you do it like the way the Malchut does it, which is they kill the person by hanging them. Talmud Lamal v'humat v'talita. The Torah has it differently. First they get killed, then they hang them, and perhaps this is why the rabbis wanted to limit the hanging as much as possible. Mimitinoto v'achar kach tolinoto, and now we're going to see how. Ha'ketzad, how is it done? This line I find really fascinating. Mashhinoto ad samuch l'shkiat hachama. We push off the killing of the person to the very last moment in the day that we could do it, okay, to basically leave just enough time to do all the things we're going to have to do. Now, you'll see. All this has to be done before Shiur. What has to happen? And in a minute, we'll talk about why we push it off till the very last minute. What happened to Zriz and Makdim and the mitzvot or something like that. Or even Inui Hadim. We're not allowed to push it off and not kill them till the next day, but yet we're going to push it off till very late in the day. So hold off. I'll explain soon. Vigomrim dino. We wait to do the psak din at the very end of the day. That's to avoid Inui Hadin. Because Inui Hadin is once you decide, you have to do it immediately. So we push off the Gemirat Hadin, the Gemar Din, the verdict, till the very end of the day. Mimitinoto, you kill him. So again, it can't be the very end of the day. You have to leave enough time to kill the person in the skila way that we've talked about. V'achar kach tolinoto, then they hang the person. Echad kosher ve'echad matio. One ties and already the other one's untying. In other words, you don't even use the same person to tie and untie because we want it to happen so quickly. So they tie and hang him while the other person's already untying it to basically have the hanging take a split second. And kedei l'kayem mitzvah tzliyah. Okay, that's also we could do mitzvah tzliyah. And then you bury the person. So you have to leave, I don't know how much time that would be, maybe half an hour, do the verdict, kill them, hang them, unhang them, and bury them. All as quickly as possible. Okay, why do we want to do this again? Because now Rashi says, Shema Yitra, and the first Rashi for where it says Gemara, Mashino Toa Gemara Dinova, Ain Tolino To Shacharit. We don't do it in the morning. Why not? Why don't we just do it in the morning and then you have all day? In other words, you want to make sure the person's buried by sunset. So why would you push it off to the very end of the day? So Rashi says something that we can all very much relate to, I think. Maybe not you, me, yes. We're worried that if you do it in the morning and you have all day to bury, you might forget and you might not bury them. And then you'll transgress this transgression. And then, therefore, you do it also. You only have, right, X amount of minutes, and therefore you're not going to stop and start doing something else and get distracted. But you do it and finish it and be done with it. Okay? Tanu Rabbanan, another bright about how they did this. Eitz. Shomeani bein betalush bein b'mechubar. Now we're going to have this debate about whether the eitz was stuck in the ground or whether it was on an angle and just put, right, propped up on the ground without being staked into the ground. So when it says eitz, right, it says talita, you should talita oto al eitz, on a tree, sounds like bein betalush bein b'mechubar. It just needs to be, eitz could be tree, but also could be a piece of wood. It doesn't matter if it's attached or detached to the ground. And that's how we get that it's just a piece of wood that we stick into the ground. Okay, we do stake it in, but it is just a piece of wood. It's not a tree. Talmud Lomar, how do we know this? Ki kavur. Misha eno mechusar ela kvura. Because it says ki kavur tikberenu, we want to make sure there's, now here we learn something interesting. They buried the piece of wood with the person. So we need something that can easily be buried. Again, assuming we have to do this all very quickly. Hikavortik berenu means, right, the double language also means also the person, also the wood, the piece, the stake they were on. So so we have to have everything ready to be buried right away. So it has to be something that's not needing to be chopped. That would already take a longer period of time. Rabbi Yossi, I'm going to take it even farther. Why does Rabbi Yossi say that it's just propped up against the wall and not staked into the ground? Because so he says, if it's staked into the ground, you're going to have to pull it out of the ground. That already is effort. That's why I think it's just propped up against the wall. And that way you just move the wood and quickly put it in the ground. And Rabbanan say it's lishalav plum. The rabbis say, no, pulling it out of the ground when you staked it into the ground, that doesn't take much effort. That's not, right? Chopping a tree, yes, but pulling it out of the ground is really not much. Now we talk about this issue of not wanting to have the body hanging there and people walking by and saying, oh, look, this is a poor reflection on God. So, etc. Tanya, Omer Rabbi Meir, Mishalom Mashal. So Rabbi Meir gives a parable. Remember, he was the man of the parables. Here's a parable of his. Lema Dabar Domer. What's this like? Now, this isn't one of those wolf parables, but L'shnei achim to'omim be'ir echad. Okay, two twin brothers in one city. Echad minahu melech, one becomes the king, v'echad yatsa le'listiut, and one becomes a robber. Tziva hamelech utzla'uhu. The king said, go hang him. Kol ha'ro'eh oto, right, the listim, the one who was a bandit, has to be hung. So when everyone sees, now they're twin brothers, they look the same. So kol ha'ro'eh oto omer hamelech taloi. Right? So everyone saw him and everyone thought, oh, look, the king is hung. And the king said, this is not good for my image. So the king said, take him down. And that's what God is saying, because we're all created in the image of God. And because this person cursed God, right, it's a reflection on God. So God doesn't want that person hung because it reflects poorly on God. Amar Rabbi Meir, my mashma. So now Rabbi Meir had said, remember the Kilalat Elohim Talui, he said, right, how does God feel when a person is convicted of murder? Halani miroshi, halani mizroli. Now, where does he get this from? So, Amar Abaye, right? My mashma means, where does this come from? Amar Abaye, Kimanda Amal, Hal late. Now, the pasuk says, Kililat Elohim Talui, which we said is, right, the one who cursed God is hung. But the darshan, this is Kal late. This is actually Aramaic. Kal ein. There's no lightness, meaning there's heaviness. Okay, and that's how he darshans it. Amarle Rava im ken kaved alai roshi, kaved alai zroim ebaile. Rava says, then it should have said heavy. Why would it say not light? It should just say heavy. This is heavy for me. Ela amar Rava kimanda amar kili alma. So Rava says it's not that it's kal late. There's not lightness, which means it's heavy. No, because then it would have just said heavy. What he says is it's lashon saginahor. It's a euphemism. It's the opposite. Okay, I said we would get back to this. The world is light for me, which really means the world is heavy for me. Hi, mibaile the gufe. So they say, wait a minute, if we're going to darshan this kilalat, but we need it for its own sake. We need kilalat to teach us who gets this, right? What kind of people? Remember, there was the whole drashah. It only thinks that this is the prop. It's someone who cursed God. So they say, well, in kenem akrap mikalel, my kilalat. right? So we could have just said mikalel, not mikalel Hashem talui, right? It didn't have to say kililat Elohim talui. Ve'ema kuli lahachi udata. So maybe then it's not teaching you what we thought, that the prat is someone who curses God. Maybe the whole thing is just coming to say God feels heavy at the time. Im ken nemakra kalat. If you want to say light, you would have said kalat, not kililat. So again, the language, my kililat shmami natarte. The fact that it said kililat and not kilel, and the fact that it said kalal and not kalat, right? So that teaches you two things. The lo zo bilvad. Okay, now we get to this other halacha about halanat hamet in general and burying people on time, whether they're sinners, whether they're not sinners. Everyone should be buried on the day they die. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai minayin lemelin. I just want to check one thing here. There's a aleph, I think. Yeah, minayin. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Yeah, some people say there's a thing about Rabbi Yochanan, the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and I was reading something recently that he was also the student of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehot Sadak. And it's possible that there's mistakes in these Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai quotes because he didn't learn from Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and perhaps he's just quoting Rabbi Shimon ben Yehot Sadak. The Girsa of the Yalkut has it without even him quoting anyone's name, because the whole problem, it's a little problematic that he quotes Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. But anyway, I'm going to leave that point aside right now. Rabbi Yochanan says Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, or maybe not in his name. How do you know that if you leave the body of any relative, again, not having to do with someone who murdered, that, or someone who's liable to death penalty, that there's a negative transgression here? Talmud Lamal, ki kavor tikberenu. Again, the double language, not just this person, also someone else, including a regular person. Mikan lemelin metosho ver below tase. So that's just the conclusion of that sentence. From here, we learn that it's a negative transgression. Ika de Amre, some people say that Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai remez lekfura min haTorah minayin. That he darshans actually something else from Kitavor Tikborun. Not that you can't leave the body overnight of a regular relative, but the fact that you actually have to bury a person. This is interesting. We take it as a given that you have to bury a person in the ground. But where do we get this from in the Torah? So he says, Talmud Lamar ki kavur tikberenu. Mikan remez l'kfura min haTorah. From here we see a source for burial in the Torah. To which we now have a story about this and about, is this really a good source? And we're going to see that Shavor Malka, who was the Persian king, was not really convinced by this source and was searching for a different source. Amalei Shavor Malka le Rav Hama. Kfura min haTorah minayin. So we have a conversation between the Persian king and Rav Hama. Where do we get kfura from the Torah? Ishtik v'lo amalei v'lo midi. Rav Hama didn't answer. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, imsar am biyadei ditipshai. Okay, crazy line. He says, what? Was the world given to rabbis who were stupid, he says, tipshai? In other words, we had this pasuk. Why didn't he quote that pasuk to Shavor Malka? To which they say, because Shavor Malka would have said, that maybe teaches you need a coffin, not that you need to bury in the ground. Could be you need a coffin, put it away, and put it somewhere, but not necessarily bury in the ground. Tikberenu lo mashmale. So we say, tikberenu, but what about, right? Ki kavor maybe teaches you about an aron, but tikberenu should teach it to you. So they say, lo mashmale. Okay, now what does it mean, lo mashmale? Shavor Malka could have said, or maybe he did say, that double language, like I don't darshan that kind of thing. I'm not convinced by that, right? And this is just interesting in general because, right, if you look at Rashi, I'll read it inside. Lo mashmale legoy, and the aleph is the Hagahot Rabach, and he changes it to the Shavor Malka. Just because it uses an extra word, people outside of the Gemara world wouldn't say, "Oh, that comes to include something else." Like they don't buy into that whole drasha type thing. Okay, and therefore that wouldn't be a good answer to give Shavor Malka. Again, if this reminds us of all these discussions with the heretics and what answers they'll accept and what they won't accept. Sometimes we have to make up answers for them that aren't our answers because they're answers that speak to them. So now we say, so we're now going to give a whole list of things that Rav Hama could have said. And then we're going to have for each one the answer. What about the fact that you see in the Torah, tzaddikim were buried, Avraham, Yitzchak, right? All those people were buried. Minhag ba'alma, you could say that was just the custom of the time. It doesn't mean the Torah says you have to do it. Midikaver akadosh baruch hu Moshe. What about God burying Moshe? Is that not a proof? No. Delolish tani minhagi. You could say God treated Moshe like everyone else in the time, but it doesn't mean you have to do it that way. Tashma, now they're going to try to bring other sources. And these sources are from the prophets that maybe could prove it. V'safdulo ko Yisrael v'kavruoto. Okay, this is Aviyah, the son of Yeravam. Now, it was told about Yeravam that he was going to die, and he was so bad that the dogs were going to lick the graves. They weren't going to add the bodies. They weren't actually going to come to burial him and his family. But he had one son who did something good, and because of his one son, he canceled these Pardesaot that his father put to block people from getting into the Judean kingdom to go to the temple. And that was, the Torah says, because there's something good he's going to do, so he will get a burial. Okay? And there you see the kavruoto. So again, that doesn't prove anything. Delolish tani minhaga. Every time we're going to say the same thing, that was just the custom, so they don't want to change from the custom. Velo yisabdu, velo yikavru. Okay, velo yikaveru. This is the people of Anatot. Yirmiyahu, the prophet, came from Anatot, and the people of Anatot didn't like Yirmiyahu, and they wanted to kill him. So the people of Anatot were punished, that it said people won't eulogize them and people won't bury them. So again, it sounds like burial is a mitzvah. To which they say, right, ledomen al pnei adamayu. Okay, that's the pasuk. They're going to be just, like fertilizer on the ground. Again, delishchanu miminhaga. No, that doesn't mean the Torah says you have to do it. It just means that it was an embarrassment for them because that was the way people did things. Okay, so in the end, the only source we have for Kvurat from the Torah is Ki Kavortik Berenu, and we don't really have an answer to Shafar Malka, and that's why Rav Hama didn't answer Shafar Malka. Because if you don't accept the world of Drashot and the way we deal with Drashot, well, then we don't really have a good answer. So now a question is asked. Ura mishum bizyona o mishum kaparahu? It's a very interesting question. Do we bury in order to prevent the body from getting from lack of respect for the body? Or is it that we want to put the body low down in order to atone for the body? And it's a way of actually demeaning the body by putting it down into the ground. Okay, so what's L'may nafkamina? What's the relevance? If somebody says, I don't want to be buried. If it's an embarrassment to the person, then basically you can't say we don't want to do it, because you can't say we're not going to do it because it's embarrassment for his relatives, like that the body wouldn't be buried. Even if the person says, I don't need it, you can't just override that. Because you can't listen to it because it's unfair for the family. It's going to be a big disgrace for their family. But iyamar mishum kaparahu, if it's kapara, that's atonement. That's very personal. And therefore, maybe the person doesn't want kapara. Ha'amar lo be'ina kapara. He says, I don't want it. So what's the situation? Tashma, let's learn it from here. Mi'deikvort tzadike, because tzadikim get buried. Now, iyamar mishum kapara, tzadike la kapara tzriche. If you say mishum kapara, righteous people don't need atonement. They're perfect. Okay, you might say they're not. Hold off. No, what do you mean? Dichtiv, Adam ein tzaddik ba'aretz sheyaseh tov v'lo yachta. Even the pasuk says it, right? This pasuk that says, right? People are, right? It's a pasuk in Kohelet. There's nobody who's perfect. Even good people sin. So of course, even tzaddikim need atonement. So that doesn't prove anything. So now they say, Tashma v'safdulo kol Yisrael v'kavruoto. Now we're going to go back to those psukim about the son Aviyah, the son of Yeravam. Iyamar, right? They buried him, and that was a good thing for him, right? So Iyamar ki echad ditave le kapara hanachnami likburu ki echad ditave le kapara. Now, if only he was getting it, but all the people in the family of Yeravam who are bad people don't get atonement, right? They need atonement. They sin terribly. They're going to need the atonement. We should put them all the way down in the ground if it's a humiliating thing and for the purposes of atonement. So they say no. It doesn't prove anything. They weren't deserving of getting the atonement. They needed it, but they weren't deserving of it. But he was a tzaddik. He needed it for whatever small things he did, and therefore he got to be buried. Tashma, last attempt here. Lo yisafdu v'lo yikaveru. They will not be eulogized. They will not be buried. Again, you say, right? So there you see. Again, it sounds like they were bad people and they're not getting buried. So that would prove they're not getting. Right? Again, you would say, right, to lo tehavi lehu kapara, you could say, again, it's just that we don't want to give them the kapara, and not that it proves the other. So we can't really have an answer. We don't really end up with an answer to this question. Now we get to another very interesting question. And this is a question that comes up a lot. Haspeda yakar dechaye havi or yakar deshach have? eulogies. Are they for the dead person or for the family? Okay, same kind of thing here. Was it the burial atonement for the body, or is it for the embarrassment for the family, right? To prevent embarrassment, humiliation for the family. Likewise, the eulogies, who are they for? Right? There's people who die who don't want eulogies, but then the family wants to eulogize because they say it's for us. It's not for the dead person. And other people say, no, that's what the dead person wanted. We're going to do what the dead person wanted. We don't care about what the family wants. Because this is an age-old debate. So let's see what the Gemara has to say about it. Lamai nafkamina. Da'amra lo tisbedu alahu gavra. Again, if somebody says, don't eulogize me. Now here they're talking about actually hiring someone to eulogize. So inami or lafukim yorshin. Okay, so if he doesn't want hespedim or she doesn't want hespedim, so again, if it's for them, you listen to them. If not, you don't. Or lafukim yorshin. What if we take the money for the eulogizers? Can we force the yorshim to spend money on eulogizers? In those days, they paid people to do this. So that would be a nafkamina, because if it's for the family and the family doesn't want to spend the money, then then no. Just one sec. You could say, right. Yeah. So I said that, right? Which is, so again, if the obligation is, if it's the hespedim or for the family could say, we don't want them. If it's for the dead person, then of course they have to spend the money on it. Tashma, so the first attempt to try to answer this question is by Vayavo Avraham l'spo l'sara u'lifkota. So Avraham comes, if you remember, according to the tradition, he was at the Akedah, and it took him a time to get back to Sarah, so they waited. Now we're going to have 4 attempts in today's daf, and each one is going to try to say it must be the kavod of the dead person, because Iyamart mishum yakar dechayehu, if it was really for the relatives who were alive, mishum yakar de Avram mashu la l'sara, what, they'd leave her body for so long just out of respect for Avram? That doesn't really make sense. To which they answer, no, not necessarily, because you could say Sarah Gufa Nichala. It really was for Sarah, but she wanted Avraham to get respect out of her burial. Tashma, second attempt to get to an answer here. V'safdulo kol Yisrael v'kaparoto. We're back to Aviyah. V'iyamar mishum yakara dechayehu. If it's the for the relatives, hanak b'nei yakarin. These people aren't deserving of respect. To which they answer, right, which shows it must be for Aviyah himself. To which they say, no, nichalu l'tzadikaya de biyakar b'hu inashi. It's Aviyah will appreciate, and again, it's not for Aviyah, it's for the relatives. But any tzaddik appreciates when people value them, even if the people who value them are Risha'im, and therefore it was for the family. And it was, again, both cases we show that it's in the best interest of the deceased, either Sarah or Aviyah, that the relatives get respect from their funeral, from their eulogies. Tashma lo yisafdu v'lo yikaveru. Okay, this is the people of Anatot. They're not going to get a proper burial, right? Now, what's the issue? If it's for the relatives, then why would we prevent them from hespedim? It's for the relatives. The relatives weren't evil. It was the people of Anatot that were evil, not necessarily their relatives. So it looks like it's for the person themselves. Again, trying to prove the same thing. To which they say, Lo nichal tzadikayer de miyakre bereshia. No, the reason they're not going to get buried is because it's not respectful for tzaddikim to eulogize evil people. This is the opposite of the previous case, right? It's not a lot of respect when a terrible person dies. It's not respectful for the family to eulogize, and that's why they're not going to get. And again, proving it really could be for the families. Tashma, last source for today, and then we'll have some more tomorrow. B'shalom tamut u'b'misrafot avotecha hamelachim harishonim asher yiyu lefanecha kein yisrafu lach v'hoi adon yispedu lach. This is about Tzidkiyahu, the king. He's the king who goes to the exile when the temple gets destroyed, but he is told, you will die like your fathers will, and you will get a eulogy. So now, now this was supposed to make Tzidkiyahu feel better. Now, if it's for his relatives, what does he care? If it's for him, that's why it's calming him, right? It's making him feel better, right? But if it's mishum yikar dechai for his relatives, my lafka leimina, what's the difference? To which they say hachi kamrale. No, what they were saying is liyak rebach Yisrael, the Jews they'll be glorified through you, like just like they did with your fathers, they're going to do with you, and that will make Tzidkiyahu feel better, knowing that in his death, his relatives and the whole nation will actually be glorified by his eulogies. So that in the end, and it's a good question because they kind of try explaining them all one way. In the end, they say the other way, whether that means that we're convinced that it is really for the relatives or it's just saying everything really could be explained in both ways. And with that, we finish for today. We'll do a quick review of our long daf. It had a lot of different topics in it. But we started with these two machlokot of Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis about which cases do you get hung, all skila cases or just ones that are like, right, someone who's kafir be'ikav. Then we had how they learned it from the riboy and miyut or klalu prat. Then we had the debate about only men get hung or also women get hung. And we talked about that. We had a whole thing about the Shimon ben Shatach story, and it was a Hora'at Sha'ah, but then we said, how could he have killed all these, right? Killing people in one day in that way should have been actually allowed based on Rav Chisda, so we had to explain Rav Chisda differently. And then we got into the new Mishnah, the next Mishnah, which talked about exactly how they did the hanging. We had all the different machlokot about, is it stuck in the ground? Is it not stuck in the ground? Everything has to happen very quickly. We learned they hang them really for 1 second and then immediately bury them. And they even push up the whole thing till late in the day so that everything is done, chick-chock, and they don't forget about it and they don't end up leaving the person. From there, we also talked about even leaving a regular relative overnight is a problem, and it's a transgression from the Torah. And then we got into some other things. Among them, we talked about these two big questions: is the kfura, is the point of burial for the to prevent disgrace, or is it actually to cause atonement by disgracing the person by putting them very low down? And then we had the second question, right? And neither of these really we had a good answer to: is the hesped for the relatives or for the deceased? And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.